I remember being 5 years old, somewhat milk-teethed, spike-haired and rose-cheeked, walking through supermarket aisles which stretched out endlessly, how the fluorescent strip lights overhead illuminated absolutely everything, how the shopping trolley got progressively heavier, harder to steer, as my mum added in groceries. It isn't hyperbole to say that it was immediate love when I caught sight of it sitting there. A spherical Pikachu plush with protruding ears and cheeks of an undeniable crimson. There was also a zip, a storage pocket inside, and 2 backstraps so it could be worn as a backpack. A transportable, adventure-ready thing. Back then, in the late 90s, early millennium, Pokemania had just begun entrenching itself in the cultural psyche. I remember each morning before school how I'd watch the anime bleary-eyed and half asleep, spellbound by the array of pocket monsters, not least Pikachu itself, and how then, in the evenings, I'd play Pokemon Blue way past my bedtime, under the covers and with the muted brilliance of a wheat torch. I remember stumbling across this lone Pikachu in the unlikeliest of places. Not a fictional Kanto forest bursting with Pokemon, but instead an identikit supermarket in an unremarkable British town. I remember pleading for my mum to buy it for me, but despite trying my hardest to persuade her, she said we couldn't afford it. So we continued on, me dragging along a heavy heart. I remember how before we turned for the next aisle, I went to take one last look back at Pikachu, but it was already gone. I can't remember the car ride home, or much else of that evening, but what I do remember is walking up the stairs that night, opening the door to my bedroom, and seeing the very same Pikachu plush backpack sitting there on top of my bed. While I wasn't looking, my mum must have picked it up and hid it underneath packaged food and other items in the trolley so she could surprise me with it later. I remember how, at the time, it felt like magic to have that Pikachu waiting for me. This was before things got complicated. I remember being 7 or 8 at a fun fair at night, the miasma of glaring neon lights illuminating the sky, the screams of people being thrust through the air on mechanical rides that seemed monstrous, like kaiju, the thump of dance music pulsating through the earth and then rattling through my small body. I remember being there with my mum and dad and visiting one last game stall. There was a specific Pokemon plushie that could be won by, I don't know, throwing hoops onto wooden pegs or firing cork guns at plastic bottles. I can't remember which Pokemon it was exactly either. It's lost in time now, but either way, I wanted it greatly. I remember my dad trying his hardest to win, but he'd only gotten enough points for a consolation prize. He asked me which of the other Pokemon plushes I'd like, and I responded like a brat, not wanting anything other than that one specific Pokemon. At random, he picked up a Snorlax, and I sulked so hard the muscles in my face ached. I remember as we drove home, I started falling asleep on the back seat with my consolation Snorlax, as yellow light from motorway lampposts strobed through the windows, and it felt good to hold this soft, sleeping creature that my dad had procured for me, but I also couldn't drop my juvenile act of frustration and resistance. I wanted a different outcome and I couldn't move past it and just be grateful. After that evening, the Snorlax was relegated to being out of sight at the back of my wardrobe, rendered invisible by a slew of cardboard boxes, hanging shirts and miscellaneous things. It was a visceral reminder of how I'd marred what should have been a nice experience. There are many other memories like this in my life where I've unnecessarily ruined something good. I try to relegate that difficult part of me. I'm not always successful. I remember being 10 or 11 years old in high summer, when school was out and the days felt like they would go on forever, when the sky would wear its finest blues, and when the sun would preside over its domain, gleaming. I remember the cool evenings, when the sun would retire briefly, and I'd sit on the faux leather of my grandmother's sofa, Game Boy Advance in hand as she'd watch reruns of old Scottish detective shows. I remember that this was the era of Sapphire and Ruby. Catching and training Pokémon was, of course, still on the agenda, but there was a novel feature within this third generation game: secret bases. The player's very own hideout in mountain caves and the hollows of trees, which could be decorated with furniture, accessories, Pokémon dolls. I remember spending so much time here, in my grandmother's company, in my secret base, simultaneously, us whiling time away until the wee hours when the rest of the world was completely silent, still. I remember when she passed away, in the spring of 2019. I remember the dream I had weeks later, as spring evolved into summer, and as I slept in the first apartment I rented alone, my own secret base, just a few streets down from where she was born. I remember we were on the opposite sides of the road, waiting for the traffic to stop so we could use the crosswalk. I was impatiently going somewhere, and she was on her way to the pub with friends, all of them dressed up, laughing, half cut already. The pedestrian sign turned green, and there, as our paths met in the middle of the crosswalk, we gave each other a warm, reassuring hug, just like we used to. And without needing to say a single word, continued our separate ways. When I woke up, the hug still lingered. I don't believe it was simply a dream. I think it was something that defied space, time, maybe even consciousness. I think it was goodbye. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch, over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at school, wishing that lessons would end so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at work, wanting my shift to finish so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch, over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at school, wishing that lessons would end so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at work, wanting my shift to finish so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch, over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at school, wishing that lessons would end so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at work, wanting my shift to finish so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember the joy of rewriting the save and starting from scratch, over and over, again and again. I remember daydreaming about Pokémon at school, wishing that lessons would end so I could play. I remember staying up too late each night because Pokémon felt more important than sleeping. I remember so many ways in which Pokemon has entwined with my life.